I'm born and grew up in France. I made my bachelor in history in Bordeaux. Then I went to Lyon for the first half of my master degree in École Normale Supérieure Lettres et Sciences Humaines and Lyon 2 University. And eventually I finished my master in Paris Sorbonne University in the Center of Social History. After having completed that, I went to Ankara in the Middle East Technical University when I am preparing my doctorate, my PhD in history. My interest in history, yes, indeed started very early when I was about 6 years old, when I was in my grandparents' house, consulting some books and especially a historical atlas. And my interest more specifically on Turkish history emerged when I was about 13, 14 years old, when I began to discover the Kemalist revolution by books, primarily. Not a trip in Turkey, not a specific encounter, by books, by reading. And I became more and more interested in this Turkish history and Ottoman also history issue as well. Some recent event, I mean, during the last 8 years, turned me to more specifically to the Armenian issue. First of all, at the end of 2006, the first censorship bill, which had been introduced in the French National Assembly, which was eventually rejected by the Senate in May 2011, but in October 2006, we could hardly know what would happen almost 5 years later. And as a result of that, I became more concerned by the question of freedom of speech and wanted to read something serious about this issue. And some months later, I read the book of Günter Levy, The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey. And having read that, I understood more clearly the gap between what is the actual state of the historical research in the United States, in UK, in Turkey and other countries, and what you can read, even honestly, in newspaper, especially in France. And last but not least, I have been insulted very seriously by a member of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation in February 2008. I sued him and I eventually won in front of the Lyon's court in 2010. So they got exactly the result exactly opposed to what they expected. I sued the co-chairman of the Coordination Council of France's Armenian Association because he did not want to remove defamatory words on his forum. And according to the French law, if he does not suppress the words, he is the main responsible for it. And I sued also the two persons who wrote it. My thesis is about the relations between the French Republic and Armenian committees, between the Mudros Armistice in 1918 and the Lausanne Treaty in 1923. These 5 years are extremely dense years. It is the time of the Turkish War of Independence, of course. And this is the most important, this is a time when the only time actually when there is a real attempt to establish a large, what they call an integral Armenia from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And France was the most involved power because they occupied Cilicia, but also the Gaziantep area, les confins militaires. And I think this aspect of the question was very important, and there are extremely few research on such subject. There is a doctoral thesis of Robert Zeiner, for instance, but he finished it in 1981, and at that time not all the documents were available, and he did not think to all the possibilities. So this is an interesting book, but you can go further. At the beginning, not that much. There was admiration of Atatürk for the French Revolution, etc. But at the beginning, not that much. However, from the very beginning, the Kemalist movement was studied by the French army, the intelligence service, who were more perspicacious, let me say, than the British ones. They understood a bit faster the importance of the movement. And as early as the end of 1990s, they tried to find a deal with the Kemalists. At the beginning, the positions were too far away to find a deal, but at least they try to make a deal. And because of the increasing difficulties of the occupation of Cilicia, because of the Franco-British rivalry, eventually they made an armistice in May 1920 and a real agreement in October 1921, the Ankara Agreement. For the time of the Paris Peace Conference, you have two different aspects contradicting themselves, let me say. First of all, you have the fact that the Ottomans were on the wrong side from the Franco-British-American perspective, and the Armenian committees on the right side against Germans, the Turks, the Austrians, etc. And the other aspect is that the territorial claims of the people pretending to represent the Armenians of the Caucasus and Ottoman Empire were completely unrealistic. To give you one concrete example, I found a report of Colonel Chardini, who was a military representative in the Caucasus. Chardini was by no means an enemy of the Armenians or a great friend of the Turks, but he said this project of an Armenia from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, this is the dream of Armenian megalomaniacs. So in the Paris Peace Conference at the time, you had this contradiction because, okay, they were on our side, but they are presenting completely unrealistic claims. Last but not least, even at the time of the Paris Peace Conference, you had the crimes of the Armenian Legion who began to concern the French government. The first report presented to the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself is dated 1918. At the end of 1918, these kind of events were considered as sufficiently important to be mentioned in a special report to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it was also problematic. It became much worse in 1920, but as early as the time of the peace conference, they began to say these people are not very reliable. For the case of the Armenian diaspora in France, you have to know that France, actually in a way not so unlike America, has a very strong tradition of assimilation. And the first basis of the community, the first wave in the 1920s, arrived at a time when assimilate yourself or die. So the assimilation was extremely strong at the time for the majority. I don't say for the more people who are very involved in Armenian politics, but for the majority, for the anonymous majority, the assimilation was very strong. And in the time of the 1960s, what remained of the Armenian identity in France, and actually it will be a bit similar to America, was not many things. And the idea to use 1915 not for remembrance, not for historical study, but as a political tool, was considered by the Armenian nationalist organization and at least by some elements of the Armenian church as the easiest way, the best way to recreate an Armenian unity, an Armenian identity in France. But actually, you could say similar things to other parts of the Armenian diaspora. In France, the overwhelming majority has a very strong pro-Armenian bias. Even Armenian or pro-Armenian scholars, I mean people who deserve to be called scholars like Serafian or Ilmar Kaiser, are mostly not translated into French. There was a lack of Turkish activity, let me say Turkish, and also a certain cowardice of some publishing house, not all, but some publishing house, and some misunderstanding and, I mean, but in a way I will be the most severe for the French specialist of Ottoman history. Very few dare to do something. Because to tell you the things very frankly, if you want to study this kind of issue, it means you are ready to be insulted, you are ready to receive death threat, and you are ready to go to the court as a result of what you suffered. If you are not ready to do so, yes, you can work agriculture in the 16th century. The Turkish archive, even according to historians who say that it was genocide, the Turkish archives are now very well managed. You have a relatively good access to the Turkish archives. There is no specific problem, including the military ones. And you had a very interesting policy of publication and translation of Ottoman documents, so nothing special to say about that. Regarding the French archives, it's a good access. The only thing is that there are some documents who are scanned currently, so it's not available immediately, but it's a very specific problem for very few years. I did not experience any problem in the British National Archive in Kew Gardens. The only real problem are in at least some Armenian archives, because to tell you the things very frankly, I sent an email to the Armenian Revolutionary Federation archives about 2 weeks ago. They did not answer. These kind of things may happen, so I resent an email some days ago. They did not answer, yes. And I know I am not the first one who try to work in such archive and who don't get any reply, or who get a reply, we are sorry, we are classifying this document, etc. From the French experience, you can distinguish some period. You have the period of the First of all, you have to know that the Turkish immigration became massive in France only in the 1970s. You had some Turks in the 1960s, but you had a lot of Turks in France since 1970s only, the end of 1970s. So you have the time of the attacks, the Asala attacks, hostage taking in the Turkish consulate in Paris in 1981, the Orly bombing, etc. So you have this time, you have first attempt, first demonstration. And the main success of the trial of the Orly bombing in 1985. After that, unfortunately, the Turks and the French of Turkish origin gave up. They have a bit forgotten about this subject. They did not react so much to the first attempt in the 1990s or in 2001. It's only during the last year that they began to react effectively, and finally, having taken the French citizenship, going to the ballots, they became an interesting electorate, and they finally you heard a bit the Turkish point of view in France. So the things are changing. It's recent, but it is significant. There is what I would like to see in an ideal world, and there is what I would like to see in a more realistic way. In an ideal world, I would like to see the implementation of the agreement of 2009 and the establishment of a joint joint commission of historians who will be able to work in all the relevant archives, but I don't think it will happen in 2015, maybe later, but in 2015 it is not quite realistic. What I would like to say more realistically in 2005, it will be a new wave of scholarly publication. I know that people are preparing things, I'm preparing my thesis, etc. I'm not alone. And I would like to see first attempt of real dialogue. I mean, such attempt took place, but something which will be more professional and more durable. Not just if you take the example of the Viennese platform. For 5 years they discussed. They published a joint compilation of documents. I have nothing against that. That's fine. I use it. It's very useful. But since 2009, they did not do anything. So it will be time to do something together for the long term, or at least the middle term, not just one book, one compilation of documents, to have a free and frank discussion, I hope. Not sufficiently publication in general, and not sufficiently scholarly publication, the archetypal case being France, where extremely few things have been translated or written directly in this language. They did not present their case sufficiently, and when they did so, sometimes it was on a too nationalist way, or I would say a too simplistic way. Maybe not that much nationalist, but too simplistic. You have to present an argument. You cannot say this is a slander. Yes, by some aspect, to some extent, it is a slander, but you have to prove what you are saying. So Turkish did not react sufficiently.